and the candidates to be relatively brief. And we'll say the same as we get to the third part, in which we'll open this up to the audience. Without further ado, let me go to the candidates. We've agreed on reverse alphabetical order. Bob Putnam noted that we had, in about 30 seconds just now, agreed on some format questions that took the Bush-Dukakis people about 6 months to agree to. Len Umina is an electrical engineer trained at the University of Massachusetts. He's been in high-tech industry, 9 years at Semiconductor Limited, 6 years at Systems Industry. He lives in Marlborough with his wife and 6 children, and has patents pending in the USA and Europe. He tells me that he is the youngest of the candidates and the one who is an outsider, who has not been in politics before, but who has jumped into this electoral campaign. Len?
Thank you very much. It's really good to be here this evening and see all these happy faces so intent on everything that we have to say to you. And I hope that we can live up to your expectations. I'm the maverick in this group. As he said, I'm the outsider. I started off in October being the only Republican candidate that could count. I knew then that there were 5 candidates. No one else would admit to that fact. They all said there were only 4 candidates. Finally, the press began to agree with me. We had 5 candidates. I understand now there's a 6th who's recently announced or about to announce. A few weeks ago, I was identified as the only candidate who could add and subtract. I, for example, knew that 100 minus 78 was 22, and my disagreement with the Republican State Committee over the amount of name recognition that I have and what that qualifies me for in my standing as a candidate has become a matter of public discussion recently, and was given as the reason that I was omitted from the debates yesterday in Saugus. However, that really had nothing to do with it. It's not my mathematical ability that qualifies me. It's not the fact that 100 minus 78 is not 22 that disqualifies me as a candidate. In fact, the problem I'm having with the politicians is over patronage. I have a very, very serious disagreement with many politicians on the subject of patronage. Why? We have a patronage-based political system in Massachusetts. Everyone knows it. It's not not reality. The press calls it a game. Many people accept it. I'm a taxpayer, a citizen, father of 6 children, and I don't accept it. And I expect it to end. And I'm going to talk about how I intend to end the patronage-based system in Massachusetts. But first, let me tell you why. I want to get patronage out of our political system because there are 25,000 children in Massachusetts who live in poverty. We have a system in Massachusetts where the elderly are shipped off like cattle to the state of New Hampshire when they can't find room for them in the nursing homes in Massachusetts because of a lack of funding. We have an educational system that is absolutely in ruins, ranking us 17th out of the 17 industrial nations. And what do? We increase tuition. Instead of doing something about the 1.1 administrators for every professor in this state. Families in Massachusetts have to send 2 wage earners into the workforce in order to make ends meet. I'm upset about that. The children that are being shipped off and not properly cared for are suffering. And I have one thing to say to those parents and to those children and to the students who are trying to get an education, and that is, help is on the way, because I'm going to do something about it. And I have one final comment for the State Committee and those who are trying to stop me from entering the political mainstream in this state. The Founding Fathers said that betrayal of the public trust was one of the greatest sins that a public official could commit. And my friends, there are people committing that sin daily in this state, and we, the public, have to wake up and pay attention to that fact. Now, exactly what is Umina proposing? Well, you know, when we were asked to prepare our talk for this evening, the letter said, talk about government of the people, by the people, for the people. Tell us what you think. Well, I'll tell you what I think. I think we have government by professional politicians and hacks, and we've got to do something to end it. We've got to give control of the government back to the people. But the question is how? How can you do that? Well, in Jefferson's day, he used high-tech information dissemination techniques to spread information about what the government was doing to the people. High-tech for him was the printing press, and he printed information and spread it around this country. And they started a revolution when taxes went from 20% to 23%. A revolution. Today, government is much more complex and much larger than it ever was in Jefferson's day. Nearly 100,000 times larger. And yet our techniques for information dissemination from government to the people have not changed. And so what I'm proposing to end the no one knows syndrome in Massachusetts is the complete computerization of our government. Every branch, every authority, every department, and I want those computers linked together on a computer network exactly the way we link computers together in private industry. And then I'm going to do something Jefferson would have done if he were here today. I'm going to give you access to those computers so that from your schools and from your libraries and from your home, if you have a personal computer, you will know where every penny in this state goes. And when you do, the hacks, the patronage, the mismanagement, the cronyism, the consulting contracts that never should have been let will disappear. Because the press will be looking, and you will be looking, and the spotlight, the public attention will be focused on what's going on in government. And then you know what, folks? We're going to have enough money for those 25,000 children that are below the poverty level in this state. And we're going to have enough money for the educational system and the reforms that we need to make. And we're going to have enough money to take care of the elderly. And we're going to have enough money to reduce taxation and make families economically viable in this state again. That's what computerization with open access will do for you, and I intend to deliver that to you. Let me close with one more comment, and I hope you'll all leave here and take this to heart. Jefferson said that every government degenerates when trusted to the rulers of the people alone. It is time we stop trusting our politicians and get involved, and I intend to give you the information that will permit you all to get involved. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Ewan, in particular for being a role model for all of our others in being exactly on schedule. Stephen Pearce is a graduate of Union College and of Duke University Law School. He's currently serving his 6th term in the Massachusetts House of Representatives and his 2nd term as the House Republican leader. Representative Pearce represents the city of Westfield and the town of Montgomery and is bidding to be the first person since Foster Ferkalow in the 1950s to be elected governor from west of Route 495. In 1988, the National Republican Legislators Association named him one of its Legislators of the Year, and in the same year he was elected chairman of the caucus of New England state legislators. Representative Pearce.
Thank you very much, Alan, and I am delighted to be here tonight at the forum sponsored by the Ripon Society and in this distinguished Institute of Politics at the Kennedy School. I'm very glad also that the order that we normally use of alphabetical order was reversed so that Len could go first and the professional politician could have an opportunity for rebuttal. I say that because I suppose that 12 years in the legislature automatically qualifies me in the eyes of many as a professional politician. But let me say also that in that context, I have had an opportunity to view government from within as well as during my student and practicing attorney days from without. And after 12 years in the legislature, And after reflecting on becoming a candidate for governor and seeking to be the first governor from Western Massachusetts in 30 years and the first Republican governor from Western Massachusetts since Calvin Coolidge, I might add, to see what government is about and to reflect as to what its role should be. And I welcome the opportunity tonight, at least in this first segment, in our opening statements, to reflect somewhat more philosophically than we often have an opportunity to do at these debates on how I see that role. It seems to me that government in our country, while a stable and enduring institution, and while our political system as a stable and enduring two-party institution continues to undergo change and continues to have to adjust. It seems to me that over the past 30 or 40 years, as has been noted by others more learned in political science than I am, that we've seen a shift away from the Depression-era model of government, particularly during the years of the Reagan Revolution, which is now being defined and refined further by President George Bush, to a different notion of government, of one of having a role that people generally respect and support, but a role that should be limited. And I think this election in Massachusetts in 1990 is, while about many issues, also about discussing and defining that great philosophical question. Because the backdrop that we now face in this state, I think, bears on that question very significantly. We were asked in the letter inviting us here tonight to reflect, because it is the occasion of President Lincoln's birthday, on the question of, do we have government of, by, and for the people in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts in 1990? And, more particularly, what has caused the apparent impasse on Beacon Hill with regard to the logjam over our state's fiscal condition and, more broadly, over our state's political system? Well, as someone who has been very much a part of that political process, particularly over the last 3 years as the House Republican leader, and over the last number of months as a candidate for governor, I can tell you, first of all, that there is no apparent impasse on Beacon Hill. The impasse is very real. So much so that I often tell the story as I go around the state to illustrate the depth of the concern within this state, hopefully with some humor. The story tells of a preacher who was sent to a very rural parish in the Midwestern part of our country, and he'd been there only a few days, and one of his new parishioners passed away. So he went into the church to say the funeral service and got to the point where he'd say a few words of eulogy and didn't know the deceased, and so he looked to the people in the congregation and said, surely one of you out there who lived with him all your lives could stand up and say a few positive words about him. No one moved, no one made a sound. But the preacher pressed on and tried once again. He said, surely among the 30 of you here who lived with him all your lives, one of you could stand up and say just one positive thing about our deceased brother. Finally, a farmer at the back of the church shuffled to his feet, looked around and said, his brother was worse. Well, various people have told me that there may not have been a time that is worse in Massachusetts in terms of confidence in government, in terms of a sense of direction. The poll numbers that reflect on this are positively staggering. Some 85 or 90% of the people in this state think the budget and the fiscal crisis is the #1 dominant issue. A vast majority of people think Massachusetts is off the right track. Standard polling question for on or off the right track. And something like 40% of the people in this state say they would leave Massachusetts and relocate elsewhere if they had the opportunity to do so. I suggest to you, my friends, that those numbers and the anger and the frustration and the distrust that all of us who are running for governor in both parties in 1990 sense out there is indicative of a real problem. And I don't think the analogy is too far apart to reflect on President Lincoln and his job in the Civil War to mend wounds and divisions that were going very, very deep, to try to keep our national government together. And I think, without overstating the analogy, that the challenge of the candidates in this race for governor in 1990, and for the one of us who ultimately wins in November, is somewhat the same challenge: to mend those wounds, to restore confidence, and to restore legitimacy to government. Just today I talked with a high-ranking member of the Dukakis administration from the other side of the aisle and the other side of many issues. And we discussed it in just those terms, and we agreed. And we certainly don't agree on much. But we agreed that the political crisis in Massachusetts is so great that the legitimacy of government, and by legitimacy I mean the general obedience and observance of government as something that should be looked up to and followed and respected, is threatened in our state. It seems to me that the way we approach that is through a broad philosophical debate. And I intend to do that in this campaign, reflecting on the nature of our state's government, the core functions of government, the ones that should be best served, that government cannot continue to overpromise and to overspend and to be all things to all people, that we need more competition within our Massachusetts political system, not just between parties, but more people entering the system, that we avoid the number of people staying too long in the legislature and the hardening of the arteries in our political system that seems to go with that. These are very fundamental questions about the nature of our state's government, but I think they really lie at the root, beyond the fiscal and other issues that we will discuss here tonight and elsewhere, lie at the very root of the crisis of confidence and the crisis in our Massachusetts political system that I believe can and will and must be resolved in this gubernatorial election. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I spent a good deal of my time in the early 70s for about 5 years involved in state politics, and the next two candidates are people who I met during that period. Paul Cronin was trained at Boston University, and I'm delighted to say at the Kennedy School of Government, where he received his MPA in 1969. In 1963, shortly after he graduated from college, he became the youngest selectman in the state when he was elected to the Board of Selectmen in the town of Andover. During the next 4 years, he served both as a selectman and as chief assistant to Congressman F. Bradford Morse. During the 4 years after that, he served as a state representative from Andover, and that is where I first met him as a member of the Joint Committee on Transportation of the legislature, before which I had frequent occasion to testify toward the end of Paul's tenure. He then served in Congress for one term, from 1973 to 1975. Since 1975, while remaining active in politics part-time, he's founded and led a private company, Highline Industries. Paul?
Thank you very much, Alan. As has been mentioned, the theme that was discussed tonight was the possibility of by, of, and for the people. And I guess that's what Massachusetts government should be all about. But I think any citizen who's been at least conscious for the last couple of years and has been listening to the debate must feel that it's really been a long time since that's been true in this state of ours. And I think part of the problem is somewhat exacerbated by the debate of the candidates that's been taking place for the last year. Most of the other candidates seem to frame the question of the future of the state's economy really in terms which enslave them to the past. It's always either cuts or taxes. And I'd like to say that we have to develop a vision for the future that looks forward to the 21st century. In many ways, it was JFK and this school, which stands in tribute to him, that really inspired the beginning of my career in public service. And it's also, particularly in the last few years, served as a beacon that continues to pull me back to public service. Now, there isn't anyone from my generation that can face public service without hearing the ringing words in your ears, ask not what your country can do for you, but ask what you can do for your country. And I think that when you go back to my beginnings, I'm a kid that came from South Boston. I lived in the nation's first federal housing project. I worked my way through school as an electrician. I paid 100% of my own expenses. And as Alan said, I was blessed in being able to have a career in public service a long time ago, at the local level as a selectman, and then in the legislature, And that's when I came to the Kennedy School. I was in the legislature. I came here full-time. And Harvard gave me an incredible opportunity. They paid 100% of my expenses. They gave me a stipend that exceeded 20% of my legislative salary. They gave me a couple of interns to work with. And I had one of the best years of my entire life. It was really the first time in my life that I could start thinking in broader terms about what government is all about and how, as an elected official, you can use that power that you get to create things that amount to making a difference. I used that knowledge when I went to Congress. I defeated John Kerry and wound up serving a term in Congress. And then, as Paul Tsongas has always been kind enough to say, he didn't defeat me, but Watergate did, in the most anti-Nixon district in the United States of America. On the one hand, when I won, I had the unique distinction of being the only person in the Congress of the United States who ran ahead of Nixon that year. Next time around, it proved to be a little bit too much to overcome. But I felt my political career was behind me then, and I started a company initially in the solar business. I got all of the rights to iTech's solar technology, started a new company, in many ways a new industry. But I also learned at that point, as solar started to die, what resilience is all about in a businessman. I was able to shift gears and buy a small little company that had some affiliation with the utilities and build it up from less than $1 million to now where it's doing about $12 million. And in doing that, I learned how important it is to be able to be resilient, to come up, to come back, to keep fighting, and to continue to make a difference. And I think that it's a combination of that business experience, the resilience it taught me, and the frustration of the last couple of years of watching this state go down the tubes, knowing how to solve the problems, and not having the power to do anything, that's brought me back. Every businessman knows that there are times in a business when you must reposition, you must reorganize, you must restructure. And in Massachusetts government in recent years, we haven't had to do that. But we're now at a point where our expectations for the services we provide to the public, in the way that we currently provide them, exceeds our resources. It's not the time to curtail those services, particularly to those who need them. But on the same hand, we can't tolerate increasing the financial burden to those who pay for them. So we've really reached the point where we have no other choice but to restructure, to reorganize from the top to the bottom. The catalyst for my thinking on this topic came when I was here in the MPA program. And as I mentioned, I was also in the legislature. And I was able at that time, because of my access to information in the legislature, do something that had never been done before. We took every single expenditure that was made in this state by any level of government, and we put it down by line item. And then with those MPA interns, we started to analyze it. And we did a first-class job. We started with two elementary principles on restructuring. The first is, if government provides a service to any level of government, it should only be provided by that level of government that can most efficiently and best provide it. Economics 101, maximum utilization of resources. The second principle was that there should be three levels of government: local, regional, and state. The local is responsible for things that are purely local, things such as plowing the streets, delivery of education. Regional is responsible for things such as public safety, things such as the delivery of water and sewer, things such as environmental matters. And then the state is responsible for things that are purely statewide in nature. We proved at that point in time that the property tax, which was then the biggest tax in the state, we could cut the property tax by better than 50% in all but 2 of the 351 cities and towns without eliminating any services at all. Now, a lot of things have happened since '69, and I don't think they've gotten better. If anything, they've got worse. And I don't have access to all of the detailed information today that I did then. But I've got no reason to believe that the magnitude of what I'm talking about is any worse than it was in '69. In fact, I'm convinced that if anything, it's a lot worse than it was then. And I have not heard any other person in the debate that we've had for the past year come up with anything close to that magnitude in solving our state's problems. Throughout my life, I've tried to live each day fully. And I think to look forward to the questions that we're going to have here, I'd like you to leave you with one thought. All of us who are competing for the governorship this year want to lead this state in a different way. I've got a specific way that I think it can be different, and I hope that just as JFK and Abraham Lincoln did, that if I'm lucky enough to be the person who represents the state of Massachusetts, we might inspire some of you who are students here today to come help us make that difference. Because if we can, once again, re-inspire the youth of this state to make a difference, then truly the best days of Massachusetts are still ahead. I look forward to your questions.
Guy Carboni is both a civil engineer with 3 degrees from MIT and a lawyer with his degree from Suffolk University. He's held a wide variety of public positions, appointive at the state level and elective at the local level. I came to know him during the early 70s when he was chief engineer of the Massachusetts Government Center Commission, the agency charged with carrying out the state portion of the Government Center project in downtown Boston. At that time, he was in charge of construction of the McCormick State Office Building. My wife works there now. She has a few things she'd like to talk to you about, Guy. But he was a treasured public servant in that role. Went on from there to become general counsel of the State Department of Labor and Industries, and then chief commissioner of the Metropolitan District Commission in the administration of Governor Ed King. For 14 years, he also served in elective positions in Watertown, first as a member of the school committee, later as a member of the Board of Selectmen. For the past decade, he's been in private legal practice in Boston, and he's also a retired reserve colonel in the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Okay?
Thank you very much, Professor Altschuler. Thank you, Ripon Society, and thank you, Kennedy School of Government, for giving us this magnificent opportunity to come here this evening. And to Mrs. Altschuler, I would say that the reason the mechanical systems aren't working there is because the state has turned down the amount of energy that's being supplied, and therefore the ventilation fans are not working. And I can tell you I designed into that a 4-pipe system so you can cool one side of the building and heat the other side. That building has the best mechanical systems in the city of Boston. Now, let me say a few, see, thanks, but you're cutting into my time. Let me say a little bit about government and what brings us here this evening. Professor Altschuler was kind and didn't say that I'm the oldest of the Republican gubernatorial candidates and the one who has about 25 years of experience in the executive branch of government. I was elected to 4 terms as a school committeeman and 2 terms as a selectman. And in that capacity, I got to know education from the inside out. I negotiated with teachers, and later on with firefighters and policemen, municipal workers, and I learned a great deal about local government. And when we talk about government for the people, believe me, local government is the very best government because you folks can see your selectmen or see your mayor at services on Sunday or on Saturday. You can talk to your school committee people, and if you've got a complaint, you can see them and talk to them. Try to talk to the governor once he gets elected. The only people that usually get to see him are the media, because we have to use the media to get our message to the people. The first thing I did when I got elected selectman was to cut the number of people who were on the payroll in Watertown. I'm the only candidate running for governor as a Republican who has ever run a very large state agency. I'm the only one who has ever cut a payroll. I know what it's about. Warren Brooks editorialized on May 16, 1980, that over at the MDC, Commissioner Carboni has cut the payroll 10% and has still set a sterling record of productivity. When I was commissioner, there were many things I could have done. I was the first engineer who was ever appointed MDC commissioner. I was interested in water and sewer and transportation and engineering, and I set about culling out those people at the MDC who were filling engineering positions who were not engineers. And indeed, I got myself in a lot of trouble because I was intent on building the MDC into the stellar agency that it was in the 30s. I started a program with Northeastern to bring in young engineers. I fired my fellow selectman who sat beside me every Monday afternoon as a selectman in Watertown. I fired him at the MDC because he was filling a position that required a degreed professional engineer. That's the kind of mess I found at the MDC. And I offer you what Warren Brooks had to say about my tenure there in 79 and 80. I taught for 4 years at Tufts University on the engineering faculty. I know education at the post-secondary level. I was very young at the time and worked very hard. I opened my office on Saturday and Sunday for the students to come in, and I gave of myself to my students. I understand, therefore, what it is to teach, and I believe that it is the very highest calling, perhaps after the ministry. I spent 9 years, as Professor Altshuler has said, superintending the design and construction of Boston's Government Center. We built the state's portion of the Government Center ahead of schedule. The last building I did, as Professor Altshuler has said, was the McCormick Building. I was responsible for the design and construction of that building, and we gave the state back $6 million. The next governor has to worry about public works and education, primarily at the post-secondary level. I offer you my credentials in that regard and say to you that we are interviewing to be the chief executive officer of this Commonwealth. And you folks are sort of the shareholders and the political activists in the Republican Party, if you will, are the board of directors for this first round of interviews. I wish it were possible to get the public to understand that the next governor has to manage problems. My dad used to say, I hear and I forget. I hear and I see and I remember. I hear, I see, and I touch, and I understand. I have touched government, I have heard it, and I've seen it, and I understand it. And when you hear candidates talk about cutting this and cutting that, and they don't talk about collective bargaining, and they don't talk about the absence of management rights, which we need from the legislature, and they don't talk about the orphaned branch of government, which is the judiciary, and they don't talk about the fact that as a Republican, I must deal with a Democrat legislature, who probably will have the votes to override my veto. I probably won't have enough votes to sustain my veto. And I've got to get along with the media, and I've got to solve the problems. And you have a candidate who has been through all this, who has spent 30 years in the Army Corps of Engineers worrying about federal emergency management, coastal zone management, and all the other things that the Corps of Engineers does in the entire New England Division of Corps of Engineers. Had there been mobilization, I would have been promoted to Brigadier General, and I would have commanded the entire New England Division Corps of Engineers. Not because I have a couple of senators who are Democrats, but because the office of the Chief of Engineers in Washington selected me in 1979 for that position. I talk about these aspects of my candidacy because you must understand that this is not the time for on-the-job training. I have been through the mill, and I've managed to level off the peaks and fill in the valleys, and I understand that is a lot more than just philosophy. It is competence, it is ideology, it is integrity, it is the ability to tell the public perhaps what they don't want to hear, but to tell them the truth. Now let me close by saying that I am the only candidate for governor on either party that I know that looks you right in the eye and tells you if you vote for the CLT petition that is now to be presented on the ballot, you deserve everything that will be visited upon you. It is utter nonsense. It'll raise the interest rates in the bonds. It'll give the legislature control over the independent authorities. And as an institution, I wouldn't give the legislature any more authority than they would drag out of me. I wish I could say to you that I do support that petition. It is popular to say so. It is nice to be the representative candidate who listens to what the public wants to hear and gives it back to them. The fact of the matter is, I would rather lose than go to the corner office as governor and not be able to do a good job, as I have done for years and years and years, and as Professor Altshuler can attest. Thank you very much.
Now we're very fortunate we have a panel of journalists, John Henning, Janet Wu, Joe Day, and Chris Lydon, who are going to ask questions of the candidates. They've agreed to be brief in the questions. The candidates have agreed to be brief in the answers. Mr. Henning is going to moderate this part of the discussion.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you to the Ripon Society and the Harvard JFK School here. As most of you know, it's the job of the press to gang up on candidates, don't listen to what they say, and make a mismatch of any message that they have for us. So the four of us have been together all day deciding who to gang up on, and here we go. First question, let's start in the reverse order. Joe Day from WNEV-TV, a question for Guy Carbone.
I'll ask you a question that you really raised yourself in your talk, and really which would relate to the other candidates as well. You are all really running against government, and that includes the legislature. How would you get along with the legislature, which is likely to be predominantly Democratic, and which you and the other candidates continue to attack in your attack on the way things are in Massachusetts? How are you going to work with whoever they are, but they're not going to be Republicans?
Well, let me say this, that in my campaigning, you have never heard me attack any individual member of the legislature. You've heard me talk about the legislature as an institution. As a matter of fact, when I was MDC commissioner, the then Senate President, who was Senate President today, after I had cut the payroll 10%, gave me 12 engineering positions, funded them, and then the Secretary of Environmental Affairs refused to allow them to be distributed to the MDC, and I couldn't hire anybody, and as a result, we couldn't get done what we had to do with Boston Harbor. Again, the way to work with the legislature is to not seek public acclaim, and for me, not to take the credit for everything. To understand that they are a co-equal branch of government as an institution. They have a job to do, and they're very jealous about the job that they have to do, and I understand that. I propose, the legislature disposes. But I can work with the leaders because when I was MDC Commissioner, and before that General Counsel for the Department of Labor and Industries, and before that Chief of Engineer for the Government Senate Commission, I got to know them all as middle management, and today they're all legislative leaders.
You got to follow, Joe? Quick follow?
Yeah, I'd like to ask you this question, Mr. Carbone. Do you think that as you look around the New England states and you realize that many other states, all of the other New England states are having the same fiscal problems that Massachusetts has, don't you think that in a way the state government of this state, including the governor, are too easy a target for you and the other Republicans and even some of the Democrats?
Gosh, I don't think it's an easy target at all. It's a moving target. I think that Republicans are going to have a very difficult time getting elected to statewide office this year because there are so few of Republicans and so many Democrats. And the Republicans are going to find that the very message that they're trying to get out there, and that is that we've got to cut and bring the size of government to make it smaller, is the very thing that the Democrats are going to turn against us, and they're going to paint us as being a bunch of tax-cutting, heartless SOBs who are going to put your mother-in-law out of the nursing home. It's going to be very difficult to do the job. That's not the way to get elected. The way to get elected is to look them right in the eye and tell them the truth.
Okay. Janet Wu from WCVB-TV with a question for Paul Cronin.
Mr. Cronin, you talked about restructuring. This is nothing new. They've been talking about restructuring on Beacon Hill for months now, if not for years. And one of the items that's been under intense scrutiny has been the Medicaid budget. There have been many proposals on how to reform or restructure the Medicaid budget. It is one of the things that they call the budget busters and must be dealt with if you are going to bring state spending under control. This everyone agrees. How specifically would you restructure the Medicaid budget? What risks would you be willing to take, and at what cost?
Let me start from the back end forward, Janet. I dispute the original premise of your question just slightly. I think that restructuring in the context that I've mentioned, I haven't heard much discussion about that in the legislature or on the Hill for the past year, although I've been talking about it for over a year. The first time I've really heard any serious discussion of it was with the governor's State of the State address. But I think that in addition to that, let me get down to the specifics. I think that the first question you've really asked is the most important one. How much risk are you prepared to take as governor to solve some of these problems? I'm prepared to take every amount of risk that it takes to solve the problems, and I'd like to tell you how. I think it's under Article 87 of the Constitution that the governor is given the power to restructure. And he can come before the legislature with any restructuring proposal, and it automatically takes effect in 60 days unless it's overturned by a majority of the legislature. The last governor, to my knowledge, that had the courage to use that article was John Volpe when he set up the cabinet system of government that we're currently operating under. And I think there's a very good reason for that. I don't know of any governor since then who was prepared to risk the political capital that it takes to make great changes happen. And I'm looking at this very differently than all the other governors in that intervening period of time. I don't want to be in politics for the rest of my life. I want to be governor for 4 years, 8 if I have to solve the problems. And then I want to get back to doing other things. I've learned in the intervening years that there is life after politics, and I'd like to enjoy some of it.
Janet?
I would beg to differ with you. Both House Ways and Means and Senate Ways and Means has offered a number of proposals for reforming the Medicaid budget.
I disagree with your context.
For example,
if you say reform, I'd agree. Restructure, I'd disagree.
Well, semantics. Well, yeah, there are a couple of things here that for example, would you support any of these things that have been advocated by House and Senate Ways and Means, particularly Senate Ways and Means? For example, turning over the assets of someone who passes away in a nursing home over to the state, having the families of those in nursing homes contribute to the cost of that person's nursing home care, perhaps 20%, 30%, depending on the family's ability to pay. For example, turning away level 3 nursing home residents, ending the Medicaid payments to them and letting them stay in nursing homes if they can afford to do it on their own. Would you support any of these, and what others would you suggest?
Janet, the simple answer to that is some of them I would support. But let me start by really saying, first of all...
Which ones would you support?
All right, give me a chance. I'll be glad to talk to you. But I think that you're still missing the point. What you're doing is you're trying to frame the debate by the way things have been done in the past. And if we've learned nothing else in the last year, it's that the system doesn't function anymore. You can't use the system of the past as a model for the future. What I want to do is have a major radical departure. Let me give you some examples, and it will include some of the things that you're talking about. I think that you should stop talking about the delivery of human services the way we've been delivering them for the last 40 to 50 years. I think that you have to start as small as with your educational system and looking at, for example, schools as human resource delivery centers, where people learn from the day they're born until the day they die, not only how to improve their minds, but how to improve their bodies, and how they learn how all of these things integrate. And they deliver the services as they're needed at the level that's closest to the people. Now, when you start with a concept like that, it includes not only restructuring Medicaid and all of the other 5 budget busters, but it includes the delivery, it includes a decision of which level of government can best deliver those services. One of the problems on why we've got so much expense in government today is we're asking a lot of different levels of government to do things they're not capable of doing, or where they're the more expensive way of delivering those services. So what I'm talking about is a dramatically different way of doing it. Now, when we get to the final analysis, would people have to give up some of their money to pay for more people in nursing homes? I think that's reasonable for people who can afford it. I don't think it's reasonable for people who can't afford it.
I'm going to have to cut you short here. We have to move on. The question for Steve Pearce from Chris Lydon of WGBH-TV.
Steve, I hadn't planned to ask you this question, but I think I have to approach it. You've been in the news over the weekend for non-payment or late payment or late filing of your tax returns. Was this a device to win the hearts and the minds of the anti-government voters out there?
No.
And if it wasn't, I know you have said that this was not a matter of saving money. They'd withheld your taxes, and it was a matter of filing a piece of paper. But the general question I'd like you to address is, what is the responsibility of public officials, especially governors, to set an example in matters like this?
Well, Christopher, I truly am glad you asked me the question, because it is a question that I recognize that I can and must address, and I knew that simply disclosing my tax returns, which I did voluntarily and had planned to do and so indicated last week, would occasion those questions. Let me say that in previous debates I have focused very specifically on the state budget and so forth, and I think I'm recognized as having talked very specifically about it, and I was referred to by one of my other Republican competitors on more than one occasion as a bean counter having the soul of an accountant. I think I put that charge to rest once and for all. But in all seriousness, and it is a serious matter, and I have apologized for it, recognizing it as a serious mistake, I would say that, and I'd bring up again, was not a question of late payment of taxes and not a question of non-payment of taxes. Taxes were paid. It were refunds that were to be claimed that I delayed in claiming, thinking wrongly that it was completely all right to do that. In fact, it appears there was a violation of the law for which there was no penalty, but nevertheless it was a violation of the law. And it is important for public officials to set an example. And it is for that reason that I am the most regretful, because I have worked very hard in my private life, and particularly in my public life, to set an example. I have, I think, a strong record of which I am very proud as a state representative for 12 years, of answering people's phone calls, taking care of their problems, casting thousands of roll call votes on difficult issues, and debating those issues for hundreds of hours on the House floor. I'm putting that public record on the line running for governor, and recognizing, as I did, that when you run for governor, when you want to be the chief executive officer of the state, there are certain things about even your private affairs that the news media and through them the public have a right to know. I nevertheless decided to run and to bring forward those matters because I felt in the overall context, and I tend to believe and certainly hope that most people agree, that weighing those things together, that foolish inattention to a private personal matter can be put in context of a serious and strong commitment to principles to which I've adhered as a public official. I think and I hope that people will do that.
Quick follow-up, Chris?
There's a lot of anti-government, anti-state government feeling in the land. As you have searched your own mind on this subject, do you think that your late filing did reflect a certain contempt for state government, maybe even a sense that over at the Revenue Department they'd never notice that they hadn't heard from Mr. Pearce?
No, I suspect that they did notice that they hadn't heard from Mr. Pearce. I don't know why they didn't do anything about it, but until maybe recently. But it does not reflect anything about my attitude of government. It simply reflects that in the mid-1980s, very frankly, Chris, I began to devote too much of my attention and energy and focus throughout my private life on my public business, and too little on my private life. And I regret that for a variety of other reasons. But my attitude about government is not so anti-government that it would result in that. And it is not anti-government, and let me just conclude by talking on a more positive note. I've had a role as a critic of government. I thought, again, long and hard before I decided to run for governor, could I make the transition in this campaign from the role of chief critic of a Democratic administration, for which there was much to criticize, as the leader of a minority party outnumbered 4-1 in the House, where you play a certain role. And I don't mean you play it artificially, but you have a role to play in the political system. The role of the governor, and the role even of a candidate for governor, is far different. It is to lead, it is to set an example, it is to offer proposals, It is to make government work. And I am a conservative and proud to say that, but I believe that government has a role to play in education, obviously in fighting crime and protecting the environment, and in providing efficient and effective human services.
Point well taken to the question.
I happen to believe that we can provide all those things much better, creatively and compassionately, while also being a conservative, and that's why I'm running.
Joe Day, a question for Len Humana.
How much would your computerization program cost?
Joe, that's a very good question. I estimate that the system that we would need in Massachusetts would cost us in the order of $500 million. On the other hand, there are estimates around as to the amount of money we'd save that range from 50 to 80% of our budget. Now, if the number is only 30%, we would save $4 billion. And that's a hell of a
Are those your
payback.
own estimates, or do they come from somewhere else?
No, actually, none of those estimates are mine. One of them came from the Boston Globe last summer, and two others came from computer research firms which actually have contracts with the state of Massachusetts and were voluntarily given to me, provided I did not disclose the sources.
I'd ask you, what about the people who aren't computer literate, but I'll ask that at another time.
I'd like to move along a little faster. Guy Carbone wants to respond to Janet, but Janet, you can ask Guy Carbone a question first.
Mr. Carbone, part of being a governor is being a realist, and you talked a little bit earlier about using the media to get the message out to the people. First, you have to be a candidate before you can become governor, and part of getting the message out to the people is basically having to be able to buy the resources to get the message out, in addition to forums like this. The last time you ran for governor, your fundraising was fairly limited. Will that change this time? And do you feel that you can run a credible campaign without raising large sums of money?
Ms. Wu, isn't it a fact that in America today, a poor man or woman can't run for governor? You have to raise the money, and that means, in many ways, mortgaging your candidacy. I'm not crying poor mouth. God's been very good to me. However, being one of 7 children none of us could speak English when we started, let me say that I don't like to take and put my hand in my pocket to run for office and have my candidacy based on how much of my money I can afford or am willing to spend. The fact of the matter is that I believe that if the media did more of what we're doing here tonight and gave the gubernatorial candidates a chance. For instance, Channel 2 has never invited me to come to speak, not even given me 2 minutes of Chris's time.
Have you given to Channel 2?
Indeed, I have given much money to Channel 2. Especially when you have Live at the Met and after some of your Nova service. The fact of the matter is that if you assay the candidates, and never mind who's the wealthiest, and never mind who's been in on Channel 44 the most, and just ask who has the background and the experience and has done the job that's closest to the job as governor, I would subscribe to you that you folks would say Guy Carbone is first among equals. I believe I've done a very creditable job of running for governor because I have not been able to spend any time on any TV program, although I've asked. I have not been interviewed by one mainline journalist in the major newspapers in Boston, although I've tried. And the fact of the matter is that why isn't it that no newspaper has yet to say that the CLT petition will visit all kinds of disaster on us, and that Guy Carbone is the only one who was telling us that, and the so-called governors, the 3 of them, won't even mention my name because I have said that the 3 of them don't know what the hell they're talking about when it comes to running state government. Now that's the best way I can answer it, by looking you right in the eye and telling you the truth. Now, can I just spend some time on what you said about...
You can spend about 30 seconds.
Okay, with regard to the Medicaid. This is a seamless web. You can't answer it in a series of discrete solutions because every one of them impacts on something else. I believe, for instance, that we've got to start with the people who provide the payments. I want to look at underwriting at the insurance level, whether or not the insurance companies are spending all their time trying to determine whether or not we insure her and not him because she has more of a chance to develop a certain disease. Now, I'm a conservative Republican who voted for Barry Goldwater. Let me say this, that it's time that Massachusetts starts to think about setting up a fund by withholding money from every taxpayer in this Commonwealth from the time he starts to go to work, to put that money away in some kind of a fund to take care of Medicaid whatever it occurs. Now, I see the problems. If you live in Massachusetts and you move to Florida, how do you handle that? But as engineers, we're trained to see problems and to solve them. You're never going to solve the problem by saying family contribute 30% because a family might not have it. If you try to say we're going to take your house, you'll never get it through the legislature. And you've got to understand that the elderly in this country caused Congress, number one, to do away with the catastrophic illness.
I don't have time to go through number 1, 2, and 3. I'm sorry, Mr. Carboni. Chris Lydon will take your message back to WGBH, but now he has a question for Paul Cronin.
Paul, the phrase downsizing government has become a cliche this year, but more particularly it's been used as if it were a constitutional or even a political principle. The Democrats have used it too, and they too have failed to define what government has been doing that it ought to think about not doing. Any one of you who gets elected would be the chief executive and chief broker with the interests. Could you give us a short speech to whether it was university students or older people or abused children or any one of those constituencies that is now thought to be in some sense a ward of the state, explain what it is that the state has been doing that it can no longer afford to do.
We don't have time for a short speech, Steve. We do have time for an answer.
Okay.
I'm sorry, Paul.
Okay. I tried to say in my initial speech that I don't think we should deny any of these people the services that are necessary to them. And when I'm talking about restructuring, I'm not necessarily talking about downsizing, Chris. What I'm talking about is redistributing the responsibilities so that that level of government that can best provide a service provides it and no other level. I mentioned in the regionalization earlier public safety. The way I got going on this whole concept was my first political promise. When I was elected a selectman in the town of Andover, it was with the help of a West Andover community group. And I said to them, if you help me get elected, I'll help you get a fire station in West Andover. Because it used to take the fire trucks 15 minutes to get out to this rapidly expanding area of town. I fulfilled that promise. In those days, the fire station cost $287,000. Can't buy a house lot in West Andover for that today. But nevertheless, we built the fire station, solved the problem of delivery of fire protection to that area. The problem was there's another fire station less than a mile away. There's a municipal boundary between the two, Andover and Lawrence. It's a classic example of the wrong level of government providing a service. If that had been done on a regional basis instead of a municipal basis, there was $287,000 worth of government resources that either could have been used for education, for human resources, or it couldn't have been utilized in taxes at all. It could have stayed in people's pockets. I think that that example is the first one that got me going, but that's why I say to Janet, you can't separate one part from the other, and you can't look at just the state government. You have to look at government in toto in the state of Massachusetts, which includes local, regional, and state. And under our Constitution, it is the state that gives all of the powers to every one of those other levels of government. So the buck truly does stop with the governor. And I think under our restructuring proposal, a governor with the courage to lead can make a huge difference in the first 100 days of the next governorship.
Joe Day, a question for Steve Pearce.
Mr. Pearce, another question on the tax situation, your own tax situation, if you will. You and I had a discussion about this afternoon. Why should the Republican voter who is weighing the various candidates not think that a person such as yourself who talks about fiscal responsibility, why should that voter, even though you've explained in a number of ways in the last few days how it happened, why should that person not question your ability to be a fiscal leader given your failure to file your tax returns in a timely fashion?
Well, Joe, I think there are essentially two reasons, and I'm very happy to say that I've talked to an awful lot of people since Saturday at events that I've been to and on the phone, and the Republican activists who are supporting my campaign and Democrats and independents who are supporting my campaign, I think take one or both of these views. The first is that they weigh the kinds of indiscretions that candidates and office holders have been accused of or have been guilty of in the past, and they weigh this in the balance with some of the others, and they think it's very slight indeed. And obviously that's not a judgment for me to make, but that's a judgment for others to make, and that's the judgment I think that is coming in. When you consider that failure to pay large amounts of taxes, which was not in question here, or other very serious wrongdoing of a criminal or ethical nature will be weighed, I think, much more heavily. The second answer I would give you is simply this. I have worked very hard for fiscal responsibility in this state government. I have a record of criticism about the policies of this administration in fiscal and other areas that is not only long, but I think it's strong. And I think it's been validated by events of the last few years. And I would tell you that my philosophy is to keep taxes as low as possible and let people do with the tax money they have or the refunds they get what they will. I don't believe that it's the power of government or anybody in government to tell people whether to buy hot fudge sundaes or summer homes or yachts or to invest it wisely or not invest it wisely, as I certainly did.
Steve, I'm going to rule you've answered his question.
The power of government is to keep taxes as low as possible, and I think that's the issue people will make the decision on.
Janet, the last question for Len Humana.
Mr. Humana, there's been a lot of talk at the State House for many months now about layoffs, and at the center of the debate has been the governor's self-imposed target of 5,000, elimination of 5,000 jobs. There's been some dispute that the governor not have control over this part of the budget when he is trying to, as he says, downsize government.
Actually, Janet, I wouldn't give this governor control over anything myself. But as far as the next governor goes, yes, I'd very much like to have some control over that system. But let me start by answering the first part of your question, or the statement that you made about the 5,000. I don't know if you saw today's Herald, but the legislature is using the Freedom of Information Act to get information as to who was laid off and how many and so on. And there's a dispute whether it's 1,000 or 5,000. And my point and the theme of my campaign is that we don't know. No one really knows what's going on. Now, as far as the motives and who should be laid off and so on, I believe that we need to cut the patronage. And that is the cuts, those are the cuts that are resisted most strongly by politicians. Fortunately, those are also the cuts that the people support most strongly. And I believe that if we can somehow connect the people with what's going on in government, which is exactly what I'm proposing to do, we can cut the patronage out of education while at the same time we increase funding in education. So I want the hacks out, I want the professors, the number increased, and I want the tuitions lowered, if not eliminated, in higher education. That's what we need to do if we're going to go from 17th to number 1, where we ought to be. Unfortunately, I'm going to need the help of everybody in this room to do that. That's it.
All right, Mr. Humana, thank you very much. I know other people want to get in. Maybe we can jump in on the next session. Thank you for inviting us, and thank you, gentlemen. We'll see you on the campaign trail.
Thank you very much to our distinguished panel of journalists, and particularly to John Henning, who gave up the opportunity to ask questions himself. So that's a particular kind of restraint. We now have some time for questions from the audience. Sir?
Well, I'd like to thank you all for coming. Though I admit it's a false sense of security, it is rather nice to be surrounded by so many Republicans here in the Kennedy School tonight. Mr. Carboni said that you all were interviewees for the position of Chief Executive Political Officer of the Commonwealth. It seems to me, however, though, that we're missing one primary applicant. And Mr. Cronin, since I assume I have to direct it to one particular person, I would like you to comment on whether you're delighted about that, disturbed about that, and possibly what that means for the future of debate and free expression of what you are all about in this campaign.
First part of it is in addressing your concerns about the lack of Republicans. I'll share with you a story that took place with one of my previous professors here, Sam Beer, who some of you may remember was one of the founders of the ADA. And he was a professor in this course that started me on this regionalization stuff. And when I was elected to Congress, the day I was sworn in, I was getting off the elevator and the door opened, and who's standing there but Sam Beer? He said, "You know, Paul Cronin," he says, "for years everybody thought the easiest way to get to Washington was to come to Harvard Square and turn left. He says, you've proven there is another path. So keep faith, you know, there is a future." But I assume your question is addressed to Mr. Weld's absence this evening. And I asked him yesterday whether he was coming. We were all at an event yesterday, with the exception of Mr. Umina. And I said, "What's so important that you cannot join us at the Kennedy School?" And he said, "I have a fundraising event in Worcester." And I said, "That's kind of like carrying coals to Newcastle." And I think that it is a shame, because I think this is one of the more intelligent audiences we've had in a long time, and both the press questions and the questions that we anticipate from all of you, I think, will help all of us become better candidates. And frankly, it's the type of debate and discussion that I enjoy and look forward to. I think it's his loss that he's not here tonight, not ours.
The four of you disagree. Surely. My name's Andy McLeod. I'm a first-year student at the Kennedy School. The four of you disagree as to the extent to which you believe actual spending reductions should be a major part of any solution to the current impasse on Beacon Hill. Could each of you briefly identify one area in which you would support some sort of funding increase, or at least an increase in support of some kind, as well as an area in which you would specifically favor a reduction in funding or a de-emphasis? To all four of them, if they can, briefly.
I think you better pick one to lead off.
All right, Mr. Carboni?
Yeah, yes, indeed. I would cut back severely on the 07 account, which is purchase of services. I believe far too much money is spent there. And again, you see, I didn't talk about 03 because I'm worried about communicable diseases, and I'm worried about those other things that where I have to find a specific person to do the job. An area where I would spend more money is in the environment, having to do with Boston Harbor, but that does not include secondary treatment for the wastewater that's going out there. I disagree with the MWRA. They're dead wrong. They're going to cost you $2 billion needlessly for the secondary treatment of the wastewater. But I'm very interested in the environment, something called clean coal technology. And Paul said that solar is passé, but if you get into the hydrogen and photovoltaic cells, it's all coming back. And I'm interested in research and in spending more money for vocational and technical education in the Commonwealth.
I want to keep these interchanges brief, so maybe what I'll do is each questioner, one candidate, so that we can have an opportunity for a few more questioners. Yes, ma'am.
Representative Pearce, in your earlier remarks, you said you felt the government had a role to play in the environment. Have you pleaded with the Republican administration to reinstate the funds to clean the Boston Harbor?
I didn't hear that. Have I interceded, or
have you pleaded with them at all to reinstate?
No, I have
funds?
not pleaded with them, but it raises a good question. I am concerned that we are very much in need of funding for the cleanup of Boston Harbor. I intend in this campaign, and Guy Carboni has also highlighted this issue, to question very vigorously, first of all, the 10-year or 8-year plan for cleaning up Boston Harbor. It is my understanding, based on some discussions with people in the academic community, that, for example, the secondary wastewater treatment component of harbor cleanups and water cleanup around the country is being questioned from a scientific standpoint as necessary or particularly productive. I think that's a very important public policy issue for the whole country for the next 10 years, and certainly very important for us as we confront the Boston Harbor cleanup. Whether that's in or out of the plan, however, the cost of the cleanup, which we must do from an environmental standpoint as well as from a legal one, is tremendous. And it is not something the state, I think, can bear alone. I would hope that Washington, the President, and the Congress will look favorably on supplying some component of that funding, and as governor, I would certainly work to achieve that end. Sir.
I'd like to ask Mr. Pearce if he would comment upon whether or not he supports the CLT petition, whether or not he thinks it should be passed.
I am supportive of it. I will cast a vote on the CLT petition as a member of the House of Representatives next April or May, not very far off. What I have said is that I have always been very supportive of Citizens for Limited Taxation. I believe in limited government. I believe in limits on government in both taxing and spending. I fought the fight almost very successfully against the 15% increase in the state income tax last summer. That is part of the rollback of the petition that I obviously support. I fought against the increase in agency fees very vigorously in 1988 that have really hurt a lot of consumers and really threatened to strangle a lot of businesses, particularly the trucking industry in Massachusetts. And the rollback of the agency fee is in the petition. I support that. Where I have a reservation and a question, and I have discussed it very openly with the proponents of CLT, is in the legislative oversight of the independent authorities. Those authorities need oversight. I don't know if they need it from the legislature, and I certainly don't know if they need it on their rates, because that might drive down the bond rating of those agencies or those authorities even further, increasing the debt service costs and really ending up costing the ratepayers that we're trying to help. That's my reservation.
I see a questioner up there?
Yes. First of all, I'd like to commend you all for your dedication to public service and thank you for coming and speaking honestly with us. If I were going to hire any one of you to be the CEO of my corporation, I would like to see a copy of your resume, and I would like to have specific answers to specific questions, as well as a list of your accomplishments. Now, I would like to know...
You have a question for a candidate?
I'd like each of the candidates to answer whether or not they'd be willing to provide such information and how that information might be disseminated to eligible voters.
Yes,
I
if you want my resume, it's right here. I'll give it to you. I can't see it. All I see is bright lights. But if you come, I'll give you my resume. And a lot of the things that we've done over the last 25, 30 years is there.
All four candidates supplied their resumes in preparation for me to introduce them this evening.
But the average voter does not get that information.
You'll have to talk to the press.
I think
quickly to that.
very quickly. All right.
I think all of us have an equivalent resume in the literature that you can pick up here tonight and would be glad to give it to you. Secondly, I think one of the things that makes me unique in the field is that I've had the experience in both government and in business. And I think the one thing you should do is judge all of us by how we've made government work. I mentioned earlier that I served at all three levels.
We agree. No, I think
okay.
It's
I want to answer the
availability
question.
of resumes.
Cut it off, that's all right.
I think we're just going to have time for two more questions because I want to give then each of the candidates 1 minute for a final statement. Yes.
Yes, hi. I'm Dave Ackley. I'm a junior studying government at Harvard. This question is to Representative Pearce. In your opening remarks, you mentioned that you wanted to see a broad philosophical debate and you wanted to solve the crisis of confidence. I'd like to ask you about one particular philosophical question and one possible crisis of confidence. I'd like to know your position on abortion, and I'd like to know whether that position on abortion will create, among Massachusetts Republicans like myself, a crisis in your candidacy for governorship of possibly the most pro-abortion state in the Union.
My position on abortion that I've held since I was a law student in the early 1970s, and I arrived at it through intellectual study and study of constitutional law and so forth, is that an unborn child is deserving of protection. I came at that very honestly and very sincerely, and I haven't basically changed that belief throughout my election in 1978 when abortion was an issue in that campaign, and now. I would tell you that one of the reasons I think I had the support of many people who have a different view on abortion is that they see both myself as a person, myself as a candidate, and the role of a governor in a broader context. Obviously, abortion is an important, emotional, and potentially very divisive issue within the public and within the Republican Party. But I think it's very important for candidates to discuss it very honestly. I've tried to do that in this campaign. I don't know how much time I've got in answering your question to try to do that, but I don't duck in answering the question, and I would look forward to further debate and discussion on it. I don't think it has to be divisive politically or socially.
Final question.
This question is for Mr. Pearce. Both President Bush and Mr. Atwater have talked about the importance of a policy of inclusion to bring racial diversity to the Republican Party in the 1990s. I'm wondering, what is your strategy to implement that policy in the state of Massachusetts to successfully attract blacks and Hispanics to the Republican Party?
Thank you for that question. I really believe that President Bush and Chairman Atwater and the Republican Party can do that. And one of the things I'm excited about as a candidate for governor and as the next governor of the state is achieving that. Let me just give you how I arrived at that. I've talked with a number of black Democrats in this state in the process of making my decision, in the process of bringing together the broad support outside the Republican Party that I think we need to win. And they tell me, and I don't think it's any secret, that they're very unhappy both with their treatment in the Democratic Party in a political sense and with the failure of many of the policies that the Democratic Party stands for in a public policy sense. And I'll give you two quick examples of the things that I think we stand for that I've strongly urged in the legislature. One is the creation of enterprise zones to kind of surgically target investment capital and risk-taking in areas of poverty and high unemployment. I went down to Roxbury 2 years ago with some black Democrats and had a news conference talking about this bill. Massachusetts is the only one of the 10 industrial states without enterprise zones. I think it can be of great benefit. The other is ownership of public housing units by tenants. I think we've got to try some different approaches that can help all citizens, but particularly those in the minority community who I don't think have been well served by the failures of the policies of the past. Thank you.
We'll now go in the reverse order for final statements. Roughly 1 minute. Guy Carboni to lead off.
Thank you, Professor Altschuler. I have in my hand a glass of Cambridge drinking water. There's too much chlorine in it. There are problems and everybody drinks it. The pipes in this grand old city have lead in it. In 1979, I went to Washington and told the EPA that you folks are dead wrong with regard to the wastewater treatment for Boston Harbor. I tried to get the Secretary of Environmental Affairs to support me. We could have solved the problem by now if somebody had listened to me. And the first thing I'm going to do when I'm governor is to make sure that I have a Republican Attorney General. And that Republican Attorney General and I are going to go back and revisit the case where the MWRA agreed with the EPA. And I'm going to try to get that Republican Attorney General involved everywhere I can, because I can tell you, if we have a Democrat as Attorney General and a Republican governor, there will be no progress, because that Republican Attorney General, strike that Democrat as Attorney General will do everything he can to scuttle the Republican governor. So we must elect, in my humble opinion, and let me close with this, not only a Republican governor, and I won't demean the importance of the other constitutional offices, but in my opinion, we must have a tandem of a Republican governor and a Republican Attorney General if there is to be progress. Thank you very much for your rapt attention, and thank you for the opportunity to present my candidacy.
Paul Cronin.
First of all, I'd like to state that I'll be here for a little while afterwards, and some of you who may have had questions, I'd be glad to respond to them. But I'd like to say very briefly that every time I've been given the opportunity to serve an elective office, I've worked very hard to make government work. And I think one of the legacies of Watergate is that we've had a generation of people who have succeeded in public life by telling you why government does not work and how they can prevent things from happening as opposed to making things happen. When I was a selectman, I served 3 years. We built a fire station, a police station, a high school, 3 elementary schools, sewered 20% of the town. And in those 3 years, we cut taxes 1 year, kept them solid the other 2. When When I was a state legislator, I was a Republican minority too, but I worked to make the system function. We had a group that went around to different state agencies because we found an old law that said as long as the legislature's in session, you've got a right to examine their books on demand. We shook a lot of those agencies up. We made some legislative changes, got a lot of bills, significant bills, enacted into law. The first substance abuse bill in the state of Massachusetts, some coastal zone management legislation, other serious pieces of legislation. When I was in Congress, we were able to get $2 million a day in grants and contracts into my district, more than any other district in the United States of America. Those are the things that I want to bring back to government. I want to make this system function once again. And I'd like to once again instill pride from people such as you by getting you involved. And I hope you're going to help me get elected because this state is in dire need of it. I look forward to your questions at the end of the session.
Steve Pearce.
Running for governor of our great Commonwealth is by far the most exciting challenge of my political life. Simply running for governor of this great state is an honor. And it's a tough and a testing process, as I've certainly found out over the last few days. But it's supposed to be, not only for the candidates, because you have a right to know who we are and what we are, but it's a tough and testing process for the people of our state in this great democracy. Elections have a purpose in our great country, particularly when a state and a political system has the problems that I alluded to at the outset. This election can be a great therapeutic and positive exercise, and I believe that it will. And I look forward to continuing to discuss the issues. I'm deeply grateful for the support of the people out there who are working so hard for my candidacy. We can go through this campaign, discuss the issues, confront every problem head-on, and get to November, and most especially January of next year, with a new administration that will restore confidence in government in Massachusetts and prepare us to meet the challenges of the 1990s. I would like to be that person, and I thank you very much for your attention and the opportunity to speak here tonight. Thank you.
Len Umina.
You know, I like slogans. They sound good, they feel good, and they make you really get up when you're listening to politicians. But frankly, as a voter and a taxpayer, I've had enough slogans, and I'm looking for some concrete proposals that are going to fix the problems we face. You know, we talked, you heard just a few minutes ago about examination of the budget on demand. What better way to examine the budget on demand than from your living room or from your school or from your library? If that had such an effect in 1960, imagine what it will do in 1990. The fact that our legislature, the people we charge with running our government, have to use the Freedom of Information Act not once, but time and time and time again, is indicative of a sickness that plagues our democracy. And so I'm asking you, deep thinkers, to go home and think about what I'm proposing. Think about Jefferson. Go back and read some of those old manuscripts, and you'll find the basics and the basis for my proposal. And I think you'll find that it's every bit as sound as the First Amendment was at the time it was proposed. It's inevitable, it will happen, and I believe that you and I should lead the country in instituting a system that will provide information for the people so that we can once again regain control of our government and make it something we can be proud of. And I want to point out one last fact in closing, if I've got just a few more seconds. Pride in any organization, certainly every one that I've ever managed, came from participation. When people participate, they gain pride in an organization, and that's what we need in government, is more participation. Thank you very much.
Let me mention that there is a reception in the penthouse of the Kennedy School, which is open to everybody who's here. You're all invited, and we hope that you'll come. On behalf of the Ripon Society and of the John F. Kennedy School of Government, Institute of Politics, let me thank the candidates particularly for coming and sharing your time with us this evening, and all of you in the audience for coming and joining with us. Thank you.